Hi, my name is Aaron. I go by the Light Fisher. The goal of this channel is to reach out to as many brothers and sisters as I can through spreading the word of God. I'll be doing so by going through chapter by chapter in the King James Version Bible. Today we're going to be starting with Genesis chapter 1. The videos will be split up because Genesis within itself is quite long. I'll be using a reference site called BibleRef.com. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The text begins by saying that God created in the beginning. Even conservative Christian scholars come to slightly different conclusions based on that verse, depending on how they understand the original Hebrew language was intended to be read. Was this the beginning, the instant of time zero, when there was no before? Or is this a reference to the beginning of God's creative work, or the season of creation? However we answer that question, it is an awesome thought that one being created all of our universe. Only God can do such a thing. The following verses will add details to God's work as creator, crediting him with forming various aspects of the universe. This is crucial not only as a means of giving God due credit, but also for dispelling suggestions that God was uninvolved or disinterested in these creations. And these words will counter claims that the stars, planets, or plants or animals are themselves divine and worthy of worship. Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Genesis 1:1 announced that God created everything, the heavens and the earth. Verse 2 begins to describe the process of that creation. According to this text, the earth was empty and literally in chaos. The Hebrew words used here are thou, tahu, and bahu, translated as formless and void. Segments of Bible scholarship disagree about whether this formlessness was the state of the earth immediately after the initial creation, or the result of some events between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. In either case, at this point in the story, the earth is covered with deep waters. Our darkness was over the surface, and the Spirit of God was over the waters. Why darkness? Light would not be created until the following verse. There can be only darkness at this point. Still, God's Spirit is moving in this darkness. God is preparing to speak, to act with great power, to bring order and light to this chaos. Genesis chapter 1 verse 3. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This verse records God's first spoken words in the Bible, words of creation. God literally speaks light into existence in the universe, as used in this form. In this passage, this is meant to be understood as natural light. While aspects of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are often debated, this is clearly not intended as a metaphor for spiritual light or something else. Before this moment, light did not exist in the physical universe. God intends for us to understand him as the creator, even of light itself. Without him, there will only be darkness. Genesis chapter 1 verse 4. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. This is the first of several times in the creation account where God will pronounce what he has just made as good. He made light, and he approved of it. Pointedly, God did not call the darkness good. In Hebrew philosophy, light was the ultimate ideal and a symbol of wisdom, goodness, and knowledge. There is powerful symbolism in God's choice to create light among the darkness of the universe. This verse begins a pattern repeated for the rest of the passage. In each of the next days of creation, God will speak something into existence, see the effect it has, declare it good, and then the text will declare the number of the day. Here, God is said to have separated darkness and light. The two would exist in the world separately from each other, with light being the dominant force. To the extent that light appears, darkness will always disappear. Darkness has no defense against light, since darkness does not really exist in and of itself. It is simply the absence of light. Genesis chapter 1 verse 5. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. God named the light day and the darkness night. Naming things is a significant act in the book of Genesis, as well as in the rest of the Bible. Naming something, in the ancient mindset, is a claim to ownership. Having the right to name something means claiming sovereignty over that thing. Later, God will task Adam to name the animals as part of his human work in ruling and subduing the earth. In part, then we see that God means to remain Lord over the night and day. He created them. He intended for day and night to exist. They are not merely an accidental consequence of the natural world. Another way to apply this point is that God is not merely creating and then allowing this creation to spin out of control. What he has created, he still maintains authority over. Finally, the verse ends with the blueprint used for the description of each of the 6 days of creation. There was evening and there was morning, the first day. From very early on, the people of Israel thought of a day as beginning in the evening at sunset and continuing until the sunset on the following day. That may explain the wording in Genesis 1 of evening and morning. As noted before, the God who is capable of speaking light into the world is certainly capable of creating as much as he would choose to in a 24-hour period of time, or of creating using a longer process. The important details are those which God has actually given. He created light and called it good. Genesis chapter 1 verse 6. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. In the prior verses, God completed the first day of creation, making light day and night. Here, God turns to the waters. Verse 2 indicated that the earth was formless, void, and covered by deep waters. Now God issues a command about those waters. Separate them. More specifically, God calls for something to be placed between the waters. A space or firmament or vault or sky or heaven, depending on the translation. The Hebrew term is raquiah, which implies something solid and supportive. The word pictured offered here seems to be of raising up the top part of the waters and exerting an open area, what we usually think of as the air above the sea or land. But what about the top layer, the waters above the sky? Some scholars suggest those are the clouds of the upper atmosphere, or simply the atmosphere itself. Others have speculated that a water canopy once existed in the upper atmosphere that is no longer there in our day. In any case, the larger point of the verse is that God's power includes the ability to order even the oceans to do his bidding, and breathable air to come into existence on the earth. Once again, God and God alone is credited with creating the world as we know it. Genesis chapter 1 verse 7. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. The ability of God to create is understated here using the Hebrew phrase Wayehi Ken, literally meaning and it was so. As much as God's existence is treated as obvious and necessary, his power and ability is also not given much detail. Rather, the focus is simply on the basic fact God intended to create, stated his intention, and then what he intended to do occurred. Regardless of interpretation, this basic idea cannot be separated from the biblical text. Genesis chapter 1 verse 8. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. The previous two verses detail the creation of an expanse between the waters of the sea and some upper level of waters. Now, in verse 8, God names that space. In Hebrew, the name he gives it is Samehayim. Biblical scholars translate this term as sky or heaven or air. In Hebrew, the word can be applied to any of these based on the context. It is not likely that the word means heaven in the sense that we normally think of it in our day. This heaven is very likely the heavens or the atmosphere, the empty space above the sea. The primary message is that on creative day 2, God formed an open space and named it, as which other aspects of creation. This counters any claim that the air, wind, or skies are themselves divine. Even the sky and atmosphere around us are an intentional part of God's creation of the earth. Genesis chapter 1 verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Here in verse 9, God separates land from ocean. More specifically, he commands the waters of the earth to be gathered into one place, and that the dry land appear. This doesn't necessarily mean that God created one single ocean, as we would understand it. However, looking at the earth as seen today, all the oceans are connected into one single, massive, continuous body of water. These waters are called seas. The word picture presented here is a global body of water punctuated by one or more land masses. Once again, the emphasis is not on minute details, but a big picture. The point of this verse, as with the rest of Genesis chapter 1, is crediting God and God alone with the power and authority to create all we see. As with verse 7, God's ability to create is understated, using the Hebrew phrase, Wayehi Ken, and it was so. For God, this act of creation is no more or less complex than this. He commands, and it is so. We stand in awe at the power being described here. With a sentence, God brings dry, habitable land to the earth, ready to support the abundance of life that he is about to create. Genesis chapter 1 verse 10. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. Once again, God recognizes what he has made as good. This is a significant state coming from the ultimate standard of everything, which is God himself. As we get to know him in the Bible, we see that he measures goodness in absolutes. To be good in this sense means that there is no bad in a thing God made during his creation. All that God made during his creation week was utterly and truly good. Genesis chapter 1 verse 11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. The wording of this verse is specific, though various translations handle it slightly differently. In general, the Hebrew phrasing around seeds and kinds implies a particular intent with creation. We are meant to understand that these plants and trees produced in themselves their own seeds. Built into them was the ability to reproduce according to their own kind. In other words, God's decree was that each kind of plant and tree would bear the seed of the next generation of that specific kind of plant and tree. This once again places a claim to God's supremacy over all aspects of creation, including the form and function of all living things. Genesis chapter 1, verse 12. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Another key fact to take from this account is that God built reproduction into his creation from the very start. His intent is clear. He would not create the world over and over again. He would create it all at once. He would make it good, and he would build into his good creation the ability to keep recreating itself according to the kind of plant, in this case which it was. Genesis chapter 1 verse 13. In the evening and the morning were the third day. This completes the pattern of Genesis chapter 1 for the first half of the creation week. In each case, God speaks, then his words are fulfilled. Then he names his creation and then declares it good. The Bible then applies a number to that creative day. Each of the first 3 days produced the conditions needed to support what God will create in each of the second 3 days. The first half of these days produced light, the sky, and the seas, and then land. The second half then will see God populate those areas with the sun and moon, birds and sea creatures, and land creatures. The lack of detail in these verses is probably deliberate. The point of Genesis chapter 1 is to deliver a powerful truth that God and God alone is responsible for the creation we see around us, and that those created things have no power. Sun, sea, trees, and sky are not gods or spirits, but objects formed by God. We may not have complete understanding of how God accomplishes his creation, but the Bible leaves no room for doubt to who is responsible and who has authority over what has been created. So we're going to end video 1 with that, the first 3 days of creation. And still